Hello, welcome to The Point World Affairs. I'm your host, Daniel Che. On our program, we delve a little deeper into some of the stories making headlines around the world. And today, to help us dissect these stories into digestible bites, we have Professor Lee Yeon of Handong University, Professor of Law, joining us here in the studio. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Well, first of all, let's get to the point by going to the keywords that you have prepared for us today.
Well, the keywords this week I think are familiar to most people, but the unfortunate incident involving the Danube Tragedy and hikikomori.
Right, and a Japanese word that many people are familiar with. First of all, let's roll the clip for the first keyword, Danube Tragedy.
A tourist boat carrying 35 passengers capsized after colliding with another cruise boat on the Danube River in Budapest, Hungary on May 29th. The tourist boat, called the Mermaid, carried 33 South Korean tourists and 2 Hungarian crew members. 7 South Koreans were rescued, and South Korea and Hungary are closely working together in the search for the missing persons.
정부로서 최대한으로 할 수 있는 것은 바로 그런 하여튼 수색 작업에 있어서 최대한 노력을 기울이고 그리고 그 왜 이런 상황이 벌어졌는지에 대해서 헝가리 측의 철저한 조사 그 결과 발표를 독려하는 것이라고 생각을 합니다.
Most of the tourists were middle-aged, with the oldest in their 70s and the youngest born in 2013. People regardless of nationality had particularly expressed their sorrows when it was reported that 3 generations of one family are among the tourists that remain unaccounted for. Hungarian authorities' early effort to search for survivors were hampered by heavy rainfall and strong river currents. It wasn't until 6 days after the boat sank that the divers were able to conduct a full-fledged search operation. South Korea is closely working with Hungary to find out what caused the ship to capsize and has requested Croatia and other countries near the Danube River for a continued search. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian captain of the cruise ship that collided with the Mermaid was arrested on June 1st and is currently being questioned by the authorities.
In Korea, we will never forget the day the Seoul sank, and it's doubly sad and painful for us to watch another tragedy in waters taking lives overseas this time. And it looks like after the survivors came to and they were talking to the press, they seem very angered, and they were intent on making sure the captain was possibly the main reason why this accident happened. The captains and the crew of 2 boats take responsibility.
Right. I think first, as been reported in the press, the captain of the Viking Sigyn, who's Ukrainian, is in detention at this moment. I think the last report is that he is trying to make bail, but the prosecution has appealed that bail decision, and so he remains in detention. And so I think at this point, the determination will initially be whether or not he has criminal liability. But that criminal liability can, of course, not just be on him, but it could also be on the company that he works for, as well as any other people who might be involved in this accident.
Could you perhaps fill us in more on the details about illegally deciding who is responsible for the accident and the measures on the compensation?
This is a difficult situation because it involves people dying. And so in this particular instance, the prosecution is going to have to determine whether or not there's criminal liability. So that will go first, whether or not a crime has been committed. So at this point, the police investigation will continue until that finishes, and the prosecutor will have time to decide whether or not to actually formally bring charges against this particular individual. But the investigation may yield other pieces of evidence which may show that others, maybe the people who are involved in maybe even the ship involving in the accident, Mermaid, could be also involved in contributing to the accident, but others as well. So we won't know for certain until the investigation is completed, until the prosecution makes a decision to prosecute. Now, in terms, as you mentioned, with respect to the survivors, as well as the surviving family members of the victims, in this particular case, then this will involve civil liability. And in this case, largely the case will probably be brought in Hungary. A civil claim will probably be made involving either negligence or wrongful death. And as a result, if there's a case that is brought and is won by the victims as well as the surviving family members, they can receive multiple forms of compensation.
According to some locals, that they were expecting an accident like this to happen because of lackadaisical safety measures or protocols. It seems like it's prevalent not just in Hungary or Korea, but in many parts of our world.
Right, and that's a good point, because in this particular case, civil liability can also be placed on the River Management Authority if there is such authority in the Danube River. And so if there is lax regulation, if in this case there were no proper rules that guided the parties in terms of determining what kind of safety measures should have been applied, then certainly they could contribute to the negligence in this particular case.
Right. Hungarian public were very supportive of those who are going through the hard times, especially for the Korean victims that were singing the Korean song Arirang and paying tribute and even raising funds to help out with the operations so far.
Right.
Right, let's move on to our last keyword. Unfortunately, this one involves lives lost as well.
Japanese citizens are in total shock amid the breakout of a random knife attack in Kawasaki and the murder committed by the country's former vice minister. On May 28th, at least 3 people died and 17 others were injured in a random knife attack that occurred in a residential district on the southern outskirts of Tokyo. The suspect, believed to be in his 50s, has stabbed himself and subsequently died from the injury. It was later revealed the suspect grew up without parents and stayed at home for a long time as he didn't have a job. 5 days after the deadly knife incident, a former vice president of agriculture was arrested for stabbing his son to death. The 76-year-old Hideaki Kumazawa stabbed his 44-year-old son. He said he committed the crime because he feared his son, a recluse, might act impulsively and attack others.
まさか息子いるとは思わないように新聞見てびっくりした。
With the connection between the two incidents leading to middle-aged hikikomori, Japan is shining a light on its modern hermits who started living reclusive from society since the 1990s as the ones creating problems.
The fact that they even have a common term for shut-ins or recluse or outcasts, hikikomori, just spells out how much of a problem this is in Japan, that perhaps this is a product of unique elements of Japanese society.
I think in this particular case, the idea of hikikomori, as you said, is I think indicative of certain kinds of societies, particularly where technology is rampant and so well developed. And I think with respect to the Japanese economy and the way it's been going for the last 30 years, you have a lot of people who are now not participating in the economy, but also I think technology contributes to this. And so people are not engaging each other as they used to in society.
There are reports of the current generation, so-called the Generation Z, or Z as some will pronounce it, are more comfortable talking through a monitor, even though they have cameras showing each other's faces.
Right. I think probably social relations have been really deeply affected by this technology. I think we all have experiences where, especially in even in this society in Korea, which is very technologically advanced, where people have cell phones, smartphones, exposed to screens all the time, where people are not interacting in the way they used to and having face-to-face conversations, kind of fellowship with each other over meals. This kind of thing is disappearing, I think, in societies. And so therefore, I think people do feel more comfortable being at home alone. I think this contributes to this kind of this social aversion to being with people. And it's very extreme. Right? But I think it's indicative of a sort of a wider phenomenon in society, even though this is a very extreme case where I don't think we expect a lot of people to do this, but I think it's indicative of this broader problem that we have in society with technology.
We live in a world where we can randomly meet people through apps, but we have a hard time striking up a conversation with someone who we meet every day as we punch in and out of work. It seems like everyone's just one bad day away from becoming someone extremely dangerous. It's important for everyone else to be aware and be able to reach out.
The Point takes a deep dive into the United States' new regulation to reinforce security of its visa application. The US State Department is requiring nearly all applicants for US visas to submit their email addresses, phone numbers, and any information about social media accounts they have used in the past 5 years. The change, which was initially proposed in March 2008, took effect starting this June. The US State Department labeled national security as their top priority when adjudicating visa applications and added they are constantly working to find mechanisms to improve the screening process to protect US citizens while supporting legitimate travel to the United States. Personal information had only been sought in the past from applicants who were born in or traveled to areas controlled by terrorist organizations. The move appears to be in line with the Trump administration's plan to beef up screening of potential immigrants and visitors, but many in and outside the US are voicing concerns that this would lead to side effects of collecting private information and discrimination.
So with this new move, more than 50 million people who visit or move to the U.S. annually will now have to give up their details like personal information, like social media details and other personal info. Was this an inevitable step forward for the Trump administration, or is this a little bit too extreme?
I think it's helpful to probably look at the history of how this occurred, actually. About 3 years ago, if you may recall, there was an attack in San Bernardino, California, where about 14 people were killed and about, I think, 22 people were injured. And there was a couple, one, I think, from a Pakistani ethnicity and his wife. And they apparently communicated through Facebook, not posting on the Facebook post itself, but using private messaging on Facebook. And as a result of that particular episode, Congress actually called for stronger scrutiny with respect to social media activity of people in giving some indication of potentially their intentions in terms of attacking the United States or engaging in some kind of effort like that. And so actually it was a bipartisan support 3 years ago to actually ask the Department of Homeland Security to come up with regulations in order to scour Facebook and other kinds of sites like Instagram, Twitter, to see if there is any bad intention of people who may be in the United States. And so as a result of this, the Department of Homeland Security eventually created a task force team in order to develop these kinds of regulations. And I think what you're seeing now is the actual implementation of these regulations, which I think were actually emanated from the Obama administration. So it's very interesting to see that this particular policy is now being implemented, because I think it has led to some concerns from others about free speech, about the way you interact with social media, and that potentially may lead to an adverse effect with respect to your visa application.
Ironic, it comes at a time when the leader of the country is most dependent on social media for everything he does.
Right. I think social media obviously is one of those areas where certainly people are today very, very active. And I think what the administration is doing, and particularly the Homeland Security Department in this case is doing, is they're trying to glean as much information. I think the term is used is extreme vetting in this case, and therefore try to find something that might catch someone in some bad act.
Right. Who better to understand the importance and intricacies of social media than President Donald Trump himself? Well, we'll get back to you, Professor Lee, in a while. But first, we're going to now connect via Skype with a local expert for more details on the matter. Rosanna Berardi at Berardi Immigration Law joins us via Skype. Hello there.
Hi, how are you?
Well, the U.S. government said it is tightening its visa screening to protect their citizens. How are Americans responding to this particular move?
Well, it doesn't come as a surprise, because about 1 year ago, the government had indicated that they were going to do this. So Americans have been put on notice. So it's not surprising. However, it's not a very popular move, because people like to think that their social media accounts are personal and private. So people have an expectation of privacy. They like to think whatever they post on Instagram or Facebook about their friends or their family or vacations is their private information. But now, if you're applying for a non-immigrant visa to the United States, that information is now going to be accessible by the United States government. So people are very unhappy about that.
All right. Thank you so much again for your time and your insights on this particular matter. We appreciate it. Now, coming back to you, Professor E, it seems like there were concerns about how would this have side effects, like delay in the process, for instance.
Yeah, I think certainly one of the issues initially when the process was going to be initiated in this case, there were concerns by different experts with respect to the kind of time, the kind of technology that would be used in order to determine whether or not these individuals who posted things on Facebook or Twitter would be a threat to U.S. national interests. And so I think the idea would be to use technology in such a way, or algorithms that would identify the kind of users and what they said on those sites in order to identify these issues. But I think the technology maybe isn't quite there yet in order to speed up the process. But I think as we continue forward in this process, you'll probably find it to be quicker and much easier.
What about the legal implications in terms of a possible hindrance of freedom of speech?
Well, for people who are visiting the United States, there's no expectation of privacy, of course, because these are not U.S. citizens. They're not going to be protected necessarily when they apply for a visa for constitutional protections. However, that being said, certainly there are these kinds of questions that arise in terms of if the government doesn't like what you say, for instance, can you be excluded? But generally speaking, the United States is a sovereign country, like any other country, can certainly exclude people that it doesn't want to be in the country. So I think this is sort of the kind of issue of sovereignty with respect to a country, and then sort of how do you deal with these issues in terms of protecting the nation from potential bad actors who may want to come in and harm the country.
The vetting started with those who visited terrorist-controlled areas, and now this is where we are at. Could we move on to something more extreme in the near future?
I think it's possible. I think the technology is developing so rapidly that you could find other kinds of information, other kinds of data that governments might want to have access to. And that's potentially very concerning, because if a government doesn't want to do it for good purposes, like protecting the country, but pointing out certain individuals and targeting them, that could potentially be a problem.
Right, profiling people beforehand, precog, if you might call, as in some of the sci-fi movies would call it, that could be a rather concerning development. But for now, I believe this is a welcome move on the part of people who are concerned in the United States about national security. Right, it's now time for us to spin the globe for some interesting happenings in various corners of our globe. Let's first start over in France.
How about trying a thrilling zipline ride that would let you slide past the Paris skyline from above? The journey kicks off from the city's iconic landmark, the Eiffel Tower. The zipline begins at the balcony of the tower, located 115 meters up, and ends at military complex École Militaire. Riders can enjoy the view while moving at 90 kilometers per hour.
Ça démarre et c'est tout doux et c'est super parce que le paysage est immense et il y a du temps, c'est incroyable.
The service was launched temporarily to coincide with the French Open to let people experience the speed equivalent to that of a tennis serve. Only 260 people are randomly selected to get the privilege of trying out the zipline. That is what you could call a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
Our next stop is Thailand.
They are joyful members of a folk music group. Although they look happy performing their music, they are in fact in fear for their lives.
ฉะนั้นแล้วพวกเรานะต้องอยู่กับปัจจุบันนะฮะไม่ต้องคิดถึงอนาคตเอาแค่ว่าวันนี้เราจะอยู่รอดยังไงวันนี้เราจะใช้ชีวิตยังไงวันนี้เราจะเอาตัวรอดได้มากน้อยแค่ไหนความปลอดภัยของวันนี้เราต้องมองไปเป็นวันๆว่าวันนี้เราผ่านไปแล้วพรุ่งนี้เราจะทำยังไงถึงจะให้เราเนี่ยปลอดภัยไม่ถูกอุ้ม
These Thai musicians from the band Phayen have fled their homes and are living communally in Laos to protect themselves. Some of their songs carry a theme that goes against or mocks the Thai monarchy, a sacred institution as far as many Thais and the law are concerned. People who blame the royal families could face a jail term of up to 15 years. The members believe they may be kidnapped or killed, and their fears are not without justification, as 6 of their close associates have disappeared since last December. None of them was arrested or sent to be tried in Thailand.
We now fly over to Russia.
From the works from the early 19th century to the ones from the modern-day art scene. It seems more suitable to think of the place as a gallery, but in fact is an apartment in Moscow. Roman Babichev is a man who calls himself an art detective, whose job is to track down neglected artworks and piece together the stories of the unsung artists who created them. Babichev gave up a successful business career in the 1990s and started collecting art for the past 30 years.
Мне кажется, если бы не произошла вот эта трагедия в 1917 году, то русское искусство могло бы занимать другое место. Очень много талантливых, мощных, энергичных, креативных художников.
He is an art archaeologist with gifted talent to dig out hidden but valuable art pieces.
Next, we head to the United States.
A newborn is wearing a graduation cap. It is made by the nurses who wanted to congratulate Sabi, who was born weighing just 245 grams for being discharged from hospital. Babies who are born weighing under 1 kilogram are more likely to develop severe complications due to their organs not fully developing. Doctors initially said Sabi would have about an hour before she dies, but she's stayed healthy for 5 months and is now cleared to leave the hospital as she now weighs 2 kilograms.
I'm just really proud of them and the baby, and to see I told you. Just like see them transform as parents and see this little baby go home that usually is like completely against all odds.
The 5-month-old is believed to be the smallest surviving newborn. The miracle she has shown is an inspiration to all of us.
Our next stop is Taiwan.
An artificial intelligence that can measure people's bone structures has been introduced at an exhibition in Taipei. The program analyzes movement of people's skeletal frames and assess their various attributes such as their gender, age, and behavioral patterns. It is said to have shown 30% more accuracy than the artificial intelligence based on face recognition. The maker of the artificial intelligence says the data collected by the bone recognition program will be used to reinforce companies' commuting system and their security-related solutions.
那举例来说，如果是有一个老年人，他单独一个人走在铁道上面，那他跌倒的话，我们就会认为这样的危险指数是比较高，我们就会去发出警报，让火车的那个驾驶员可以及时去把火车停下来。
AI collects people's data to ensure a safer environment for people. We expect more improvements to come in the near future.
Bad enough, my mom always tells me to stop slouching. We have machines that can judge people based on their skeletal structures, about what kind of person they are. What do you make of this machine being, I suppose, the American Idol judges of people and their qualities?
I think we've only begun to see the ramifications of AI and its implications around the world, and its application, particularly in this case, in identifying features and identifying how old you are based on those features. But I think of it as sort of a double-edged sword in this case. I mean, certainly you can see the benefits of AI in medical services, even legal services, education. I think it's going to make life a lot easier and more efficient for people. But on the other hand, the use of governments, I think particularly, is kind of scary to think about, because I think particularly in China, where you have the use of AI in terms of their social credit system, where they are using facial technology and then algorithms and identifying certain people and then giving them points based on their sort of behavior in the country, and then be able to track people really easily through cell phones or other kinds of interfaces. I think that just potentially gives the government too much control, and I think you're seeing the ramifications of this in places like China, where people are being, I think, pushed down because of the use of AI in terms of the government's interests.
The problem here is not the machines or the algorithms of AI, but the government in your context. More importantly, I think people will be a little bit scared about machines becoming more smart than cockroaches or insects, that one day they might be able to take over the world like in some sci-fi movies.
Well, in fact, actually, there are a lot of NGO groups or human rights groups that are arguing against AI, particularly in the field of battle. They're calling them, I think in this case, killer robots, literally. Has a sort of Terminator type of feel to it. But these are sort of autonomous machines that have algorithms that will decide which targets to hit. And I think this becomes a potentially big issue in legal settings, because the question of who's responsible then if someone attacks a target and it's an algorithm that decides that you're the target. And that becomes a huge issue in terms of morality, but also the law.
Well, the next story is quite a moving one. The world's smallest baby discharged from the hospital. The doctor says she would not make it, only survive for an hour, but it's a giant miracle by the tiniest wonder.
Indeed, she was just born, I think, 23 weeks and 3 days. And so, as they were saying, this is the youngest that anyone has been born outside the womb. And I think that's just a great reminder to all of us that life is very precious, whether it's in the womb, whether you're a little child, whether you're a teenager, whether you're an adult, or the elderly for that matter, that life is really precious, and it's a great gift that cannot be taken for granted.
Right, we've come to the part where we thank you so much and express our gratitude for bringing these stories with us and your insights. Professor Lee Hee-yeon, thank you so much for being here with us.
You're very welcome.
Well, and that's all the stories we have brought with us today. For more, do tune in again, same time next week for a brand new episode of The Point World Affairs. Thank you for watching.